On to our next panel, Enterprise in Europe, Keeping Europe Competitive. Over to my colleague Simon Kennedy.
Some might think Making Europe Competitive would be a better title, but to join us on discussing ways that Europe can become a more attractive place for business, James Kahn, founder and CEO of Hamilton Bradshaw, and perhaps more famous as a resident dragon of Dragon's Den. Ken Jones, the Chief Operating Officer of Astellas Pharma Europe Limited, and Nikolas Papadopoulos, the Chairman of the House Standing Committee on Financial and Budgetary Affairs, the House of Representatives of Cyprus. Ken, I'd like to start, if you may, in discussing how Europe can become perhaps more competitive and your experience of business and how you've tried to achieve that.
Okay, I'll start with Astellas Pharma Europe is a Japanese company formed from two Japanese pharmaceutical companies that merged 5 years ago. And the European side of the business was developed and run as a separate entity from the get-go. The strategy was very important to be successful in Europe. It did just want a presence in Japan and a presence in the US. It had a global ambition, and so Europe was a strategic intent for the company. And the strategy for Europe was and is today one of progressive caution. And we acquired two European local companies to be the platform for two of our proprietary drug products, which actually turned out to be two blockbusters. And that enabled us then to move from the traditional European top 5 countries out and all the way into Russia, actually. Interestingly, because it's a Japanese company, they know that Japan does business in a different way. We look at Europe not as a single block, but actually as individual countries. And therefore, the approach in which we approach each country is really looking at the local environment. Now, a progressive caution strategy is one where we don't just jump in. So normally what we did historically was go into a country, work with third-party distributor, from there eventually have our own employees start, and then eventually take over the business. And that enabled us, to learn the market, understand the dynamics in the market, which is different, because healthcare treatment is different in each country. The way in which healthcare is delivered is different. The national public health policies are different. And therefore, you need to understand those nuances in order to be effective. If you try to do one size fits all, we know it doesn't work. And so we never have approached that. And that's really true now when we look at, for example, entering to the emerging markets, which for us is quite important. Only 45% of our sales comes from the European top 5 countries, so Germany, France, Spain, Italy, UK. The remaining actually comes from the rest of the markets, emerging markets. And for us, Russia, for example, is quite an important one. And it's an interesting market, and listening to the person before us panel, it's very challenging. However, within that, you can actually try to achieve things. And for example, the first thing to understand about the industry is actually the price of oil has a huge correlation to what's going to happen in the pharma industry. Essentially, the price needs to be about $100 or more in order for them to actually meet the commitment they made in terms of giving reimbursed health care to their population. And so we always kind of watch the price of oil to determine what's going to happen in terms of the national health budget. And so we do hope it's usually above $100. The last comment really is that if I could send a message to myself 5 years ago when I started the European operation, I would tell myself never to underestimate the necessity of agility in your quest to actually look at competitive advantage. And when you look at Europe as a region, I think it's difficult to see sometimes the competitive advantage. But I think on a country-by-country basis, actually, those who take are those who have agility. And that's what I think our organization tries to do. And I think in order to be competitive advantage, that's what you have to do.
James, what mistakes do you see businesses making when it comes to investing their money and trying to emerge out of their maybe domestic markets?
I think the main challenge, the question is, could Europe be more competitive? I think the perception that we used to have was Europe as a kind of a block, I think has absolutely fundamentally changed. And I think entrepreneurs and businesses should not really look at Europe, I think, as one entity, because actually it's not. It's 27 different legal entities. And I think as SME businesses, I think that is quite a dangerous strategy, because when you are doing business in those countries, you have the clear challenges of regulatory risk, financial risk, currency risk. I think from the UK's perspective, I think these are challenges and barriers of doing business there. One of the businesses that I've invested in, trades across that particular platform. And I think the key lesson that I've learned is actually, unless you represent or have a strong platform of your domestic market, I think sometimes it's very naive to assume that doing business in Cyprus or Greece or, Turkey is going to be any easier. And I think what happens is people think that there's all these big markets, and yet when you ask the obvious question, how much of your domestic market do you have? And people say 0.12%. So it begs the question, if you can't do business in Richmond, what makes you think you can do it, in Turkey? So I think the key message for me, especially for SMEs, and if you look at the SME arena, SMEs represent 99% of the economy of Europe. The average number of people an SME employs is sub 10 people, and therefore the fuel of the economy is the SME market. And I think SMEs is where we should be focusing on. But I do think that throughout Europe and the UK, you should really focus firstly on your own marketplace. And I think before you jump and take those kind of risks, it is quite dangerous. And I think all the businesses that I'm directly involved with, that is always my key, because regulation, taxation, employment law, logistics, these are all barriers of doing business. And to understand a market that you operate in, understanding your competition, understanding the competitors in that market, are fundamental to doing business. And the question is, how can you know that across 27 different countries? And that's where I think you either lose money or make mistakes.
Nicholas, what can governments be doing, and maybe what has Cyprus done, to lure the investment in, to make the economies more competitive?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that I think I'm at a fair disadvantage, because I think these two gentlemen here represent what's good about competition.